At 200 hours, August 11th, 2025, Russian troops punched 6 miles deep into Ukrainian lines near Pokrovsk. For Moscow, this was supposed to be the breakthrough. Maps lit up with a red spear tearing through villages, threatening to roll toward Kostiantynivka or seize the supply hub of Pokrovsk. Panic spread as Ukraine was stretched too thin to hold. Russian commanders believed they had finally cracked the fortress belt, but they never realized they had walked straight into a trap. August 12th. Before the sun rose, Azov Brigade moved. Drones tracked every Russian motorcycle, every truck, every soldier slipping into basements to hide. Instead of retreating, Ukraine let the column stretch, overextend, and choke itself. Then the hammer fell. FPV drones skimmed treetops, smashing into vehicles. Snipers cut down officers as they tried to regroup. Pre-sighted artillery zeroed in, detonating in courtyards and alleys. The battlefield flipped from Russian advance to Russian massacre in minutes. Come on! By August 14th, the breakthrough had collapsed into carnage. Ukrainian flags went back up over 6 recaptured villages. According to Azov, 385 Russian soldiers were dead, 37 vehicles destroyed, their twisted frames scattered across blackened fields, entire units erased before reinforcements even knew what hit them. What Moscow promised as its deepest push in months became its bloodiest humiliation in weeks. Putin's forces didn't just lose ground, they lost the illusion of momentum. Turns out, Pokrovsk wasn't a battle, but a trap sprung with brutal precision, and the ripples shaking far beyond Donetsk. But to understand what happened near Pokrovsk, you have to step back and see how carefully Ukraine set the stage. This wasn't luck, it was calculation. For weeks, Ukrainian drones swarmed the skies above Donetsk. They weren't just spotting trenches, they were watching Russian troops massing. Convoys of motorcycles, dirt bikes, and troop carriers crept forward. Command posts buzzed with new chatter. Ukraine saw it all, every formation, rotation, and buildup. And instead of moving to block the push, Ukraine made a radical decision. Let Russia come. Let them think they had pierced the line and drive their red arrow deeper on the map. In other words, lure them into the salient and turn Pokrovsk into a kill zone. That gamble hinged on one unit, the Azov Brigade. For years, Azov has been the firefighters of Ukraine's defense, rushing to plug gaps wherever the line seemed ready to collapse. But this time, they weren't called to defend. They were redeployed to strike, to spring the trap. Azov fighters had prepared hidden kill zones. Pre-sighted artillery coordinates marked village squares, tree lines, and choke points. Drone pilots mapped Russian staging areas down to individual windows in half-collapsed houses. Snipers positioned themselves not at the front, but on the flanks, ready to cut down any officer who tried to rally men once the panic set in. It was high risk. Ukraine's manpower has been stretched thin for months, with many troops dead, something Zelensky confirmed.
We don't have too much time because we have a lot of wounded and dead people on the battlefield.
So sending Azov forward meant fewer reserves to cover the next breakthrough. If Russia had spotted the movements, if Moscow had concealed a second, larger force ready to pounce, the trap could have flipped back onto Ukraine. Azov could have been cut off themselves. But Kiev gambled, and it worked. Why? Because Russia was blind. Their reconnaissance drones failed to detect Azov's redeployment. Their signal units never picked up the hidden concentrations. Overconfident from the apparent breakthrough, Russian commanders believed they had caught Ukraine flat-footed. In reality, they had stumbled into a noose. The trap closed fast. On August 12th, as Russian units pushed deeper, Ukraine let the salient stretch further. The longer the spear, the easier it was to snap. Then Azov struck from the sides. FPV drones slammed into lead vehicles. Artillery fire saturated pocketed groups. Snipers eliminated soldiers before they could organize a retreat. By August 14th, the spearhead wasn't an advance, it was a graveyard. This was strategic genius. Ukraine let Russia believe it was winning, only to collapse the entire attack at the moment Moscow thought it had momentum. Instead of a domino effect against Ukrainian defenses, the dominoes toppled against Russia. 6 villages retaken, hundreds of soldiers dead, dozens of vehicles turned to smoldering wreckage. The lesson was stark. In a war dominated by surveillance, deception is everything. Ukraine's Iron Curtain of drones let them watch the buildup without revealing their own moves. They showed weakness, feigned panic, and baited Moscow into overextending. When the hammer fell, it wasn't just a counterattack. It was a reminder that in Donetsk, initiative still belongs to Kiev. Azov didn't just fight, they humiliated an enemy that thought it was finally on the verge of breaking through. But then Pokrovsk wasn't an accident, and it was no one-off miracle, but part of a larger pattern, a brutal chain of counterstrikes showing the world that Ukraine is still capable of not just holding ground, but dictating how this war is fought. August 11th was the date Russia bragged about their advance. They had cut 6 miles deep into Donetsk lines, claiming villages, waving flags, and crowing about the collapse of Ukraine's defenses. But within 3 days, the red arrow pointing toward Pokrovsk on military maps was erased. The Azov Brigade ripped the spearhead out, leaving 385 Russian soldiers dead and 37 vehicles burned in fields. But this wasn't the only shock Moscow has suffered in recent weeks. While the headlines blared about Pokrovsk, Ukrainian units were striking on other fronts with the same cold precision. At dawn, near the Nazogol River crossing, Russia's lifeline convoys rolled under cover of mist, fuel trucks, ammunition haulers, logistics vehicles keeping the Donbass advance alive. They didn't know Ukrainian drones had been watching them for hours. First came the swarm. Dozens of FPV drones skimmed just 6 feet above the water, mapping defenses, revealing bunkers, even exposing mine wires strung beneath the bridge. Decoys drew fire, then HIMARS rockets screamed in from 12 miles out, ripping Russian anti-air nests to pieces. Overhead, Su-27 fighters slashed low, launching anti-radar missiles that blinded Russian electronic jammers. Seconds later, a kamikaze drone smashed into a prized RB-341V Lear-3 jammer truck, the crown jewel of Russia's electronic warfare arsenal. The blast gutted it in an instant. Then came the hammer blow. Ukrainian engineers turned Russia's own minefield against them. A vampire drone nosed into a TM-62 pressure plate under the bridge. The resulting blast set off nearly 8 tons of TNT chained across the structure. In a thunderous roar, the bridge deck erupted skyward, 2 spans collapsing into the river in a geyser of concrete and rebar. Moscow's lifeline was gone, their supply artery severed, a logistical nightmare born in 5 minutes of precision chaos. While Pokrovsk was proving Ukraine's infantry could encircle and annihilate, Nazogol proved Ukraine could still cut Russia's arteries at will. And the blows kept coming. In Dobropilya, Russian diversion groups thought they had a foothold. They slipped into houses, cellars, and ruined buildings, staging a guerrilla-style push with motorcycles and dirt bikes. For a moment, it looked like another small Russian advance. Then the drones came. Azov units and the 93rd Mechanized Brigade mapped them from above, struck with artillery barrages, and even rolled ground robots with machine guns through the streets. By the end, the survivors were either captured or buried under rubble. The message was the same as at Pokrovsk. Every Russian breakthrough was a setup. Every small advance was a chance for Ukraine to spring the jaws shut. Even Russia's reinforcements were chewed apart. When Moscow tried to reconnect with cut-off units near Pokrovsk, Azov's elite snipers and Magyar's Birds drone battalion turned open fields into killing grounds. Russian punishment units, conscripts sent forward as cannon fodder, were ripped apart by FPV kamikaze drones before they could even set up positions. Artillery crews didn't even have time to fire before observation drones painted them for destruction. Pokrovsk proved the Azov Brigade could turn Moscow's proudest assault into a graveyard. Nazogol proved Ukraine could cripple logistics with precision strikes. Dobropilya showed that even guerrilla infiltrations were being choked out. Together, they paint a picture. Pokrovsk is not an isolated win. It's the emblem of a wider Ukrainian stance, a refusal to break, a refusal to yield. For Russia, every advance is now haunted by a question: is this real or is this another trap? That kind of uncertainty is lethal. Armies don't just need weapons, they need confidence. And right now, Russian confidence is bleeding out as fast as their men are. Ukraine's strategy is clear: force Moscow to pay in blood for every mile, then rip away even those gains in a storm of steel. From Pokrovsk to Nazogol, from Dobropilya to Kiev's burning skyline, the war has entered a phase where Ukraine isn't just fighting back, it's dictating how Russia dies. Moscow didn't waste a second. Within hours of Ukraine announcing the destruction of 385 Russian soldiers near Pokrovsk, Kremlin channels were already on the air, insisting nothing had happened. Russia called it a minor skirmish, claiming just a handful of losses. State outlets mocked the idea of a trap, spinning it as nothing more than a Ukrainian fantasy cooked up for Western headlines. Putin even referred to Ukraine as being Russia's.
Раз говорил, что считаю русский и украинский народ одним народом на самом деле. В этом смысле вся Украина наша. Но, знаете, у нас есть такая старинная, это не поговорка, не притча, а старинное правило. Там, где ступает нога русского солдата, то наш.
But the denials rang hollow. Satellite imagery showed blackened vehicles on the approaches where Russia had claimed its advance. Commercial drone footage verified the smoke columns rising from villages. Russia said it still controlled. This is the information war, and it runs parallel to the battlefield. Every strike is followed by a propaganda counterstrike. For Ukraine, the goal is to show the world that it can still fight, that every Western weapon is buying real results. For Russia, the mission is to erase humiliation, to convince its people that their army remains unstoppable. The truth is caught in the middle. Ukrainian commanders talk about wreckage, body counts, and seized villages. Russian media shows polished anchors smiling, saying the front line is stable, but the battlefield tells its own story. Burned tanks, shattered motorcycles, intercepted communications of units begging for evacuation. Turns out, the war is no longer just fought with missiles and drones. It is fought with narratives, with every side trying to frame victories and erase losses. At Pokrovsk, the wreckage itself is louder than Moscow's denial, and that makes this propaganda war just as important as the fight in the trenches. The trap at Pokrovsk humiliated Moscow, and the Kremlin needed revenge. Just days later, Russia answered with fire from the skies. In what Ukrainian officials called the second largest air assault of the entire war, nearly 600 Iranian-style attack drones and 30 ballistic and cruise missiles rained down on Kiev and surrounding cities in one brutal night. The attack began at sundown and didn't end until dawn. For 9 straight hours, air raid sirens wailed without pause. A city of 3 million forced into basements and subway tunnels, children clutching blankets as explosions shook the ground above. Ukrainian air defenses fought ferociously, shooting down wave after wave, but sheer numbers overwhelmed the shield. By morning, the city was burning. At least 18 civilians were confirmed dead. Among them were several children, the youngest just 2 years old.
Russia's war with Ukraine is another conflict that the Trump administration has vowed to end, but efforts to do so are struggling to gain traction. Ukrainian officials say at least 18 people were killed and dozens were wounded overnight in what has been described as a massive attack on the capital.
Dozens more were pulled from the rubble, alive but broken, carried out by rescue teams covered in dust and blood. Over 500 emergency workers and 1,000 police officers clawed through shattered concrete and twisted rebar with their bare hands, digging for anyone still trapped. The scenes looked like something from a natural disaster, except this was man-made, a deliberate strike. And these weren't just random targets. The barrage struck residential blocks, playgrounds, and shopping centers. One missile slammed directly into the European Union's mission office. Another tore through a British council facility. The symbolism was unmistakable. Russia wasn't just lashing out at Ukraine. It was aiming at the West itself, daring Europe and NATO to respond.
Years old, there are still rescue workers digging through the rubble, Becky. There was 500 rescue workers and 1,000 policemen on the ground. It gives you a sense of the scope and scale of this attack, which hit residential buildings, kindergartens. It even struck a European Union mission building and a building for the British Council. And both the EU and the UK have called Russian diplomats to ask them about these attacks. That's why you've heard President Zelensky today pointing to these attacks and saying, look, it is clear that President Putin is not serious about peace. He says that President Putin is choosing ballistic missiles over the negotiating table. And
Kiev's skyline was left scarred. Entire apartment towers burned through the night. Their glass windows melted away, their stairwells filled with smoke. Families who had gone to bed thinking they might finally sleep were instead pulled from rubble at dawn, their lives destroyed in an instant. It's clear this was retaliation, not for a strategic target, but for humiliation. The trap at Pokrovsk had shattered the myth of Russian momentum against civilians. Officials described it as the cost of Russia's anger. The Azov Brigade may have crushed hundreds of soldiers on the front line, but in Kiev, it was the innocent who paid the price. And the message was clear. Every Ukrainian victory on the battlefield will be answered with terror from the sky. And this came only days after Trump and Putin stood side by side in Alaska, smiling for the cameras and talking about peace. Analysts had already warned there would be no real off-ramps, no ceasefire, just empty promises. The scale of this assault made that clear.
Trump, silent. As of now, the President of the United States has not said a word after Putin launched one of his most powerful strikes against Ukraine. More than 20 people in Kiev killed by hundreds of Russian missiles and drones.
But behind the horror was a deeper meaning. By striking diplomatic buildings, Russia was making the war bigger than Ukraine. A missile through an EU mission and a blast at the British Council were a message to the world. This isn't just Moscow against Kiev. This is Moscow against the West. The Pokrovsk battle may have been fought in Donetsk, but its echoes were heard in European capitals as smoke rose over Kiev. It was an escalation wrapped in symbolism. Moscow had been embarrassed, so Moscow tried to remind the world of its reach. The Pokrovsk trap killed soldiers. The Kiev strike killed children. Together, they painted the picture of a war that is spinning further out of control, one where victories on the battlefield are always shadowed by tragedies in the cities. The battle near Pokrovsk and the firestorm over Kiev are not isolated moments. They are links in the same brutal chain. Every Ukrainian win forces Moscow to lash out harder, and every Russian retaliation steals Kiev's resolve. It is a cycle that keeps tightening, with no pause, no relief, only escalation. Just weeks ago, Trump and Putin posed in Alaska for peace talks. Cameras caught the handshakes, the stiff smiles, the vague talk of off-ramps. But the reality is written in blood and smoke. Pokrovsk showed Ukraine is far from breaking, while the assault on Kiev proved Russia is willing to unleash terror not just on soldiers, but on children, families, and even the diplomatic heart of Europe. Ukraine, emboldened by the success of Azov near Pokrovsk and by precision drone strikes tearing apart Russian supply lines, now fights with a confidence it has not had in months. Every wrecked convoy, every collapsed bridge, every dead Russian soldier feeds a growing belief in Kiev that victory, however long it take, is still possible. But Russia is escalating in parallel, turning humiliation into rage. 600 drones and 30 missiles raining down on Kiev in one night was not only vengeance, it was a message. By striking the EU mission office and shredding a British Council facility, Moscow made clear it is not just fighting Ukraine, it is confronting the West itself, daring NATO and Europe to flinch. And now the stakes are spiraling. The war is no longer about a single front line or a single city. It is about whether Putin can grind Ukraine into submission, or whether Ukraine, with Western backing, can bleed Russia until it collapses from within. Between those two futures lies only destruction. Turns out the peace table in Alaska was empty words. The battlefield is now the only negotiation, and it is being written with fire and steel. Europe watches nervously. NATO reinforces, and Washington debates its limits. But the war moves faster than diplomacy, and now tension deepens. If Pokrovsk and Kiev are just the latest moves, what comes next? Another raid, another strike, another escalation? The truth is simple and terrifying. The cycle has no brakes, and the next turn of the wheel could decide not just the fate of Ukraine, but the future of Europe itself.